I get asked about the market all the time, and this year has been very interesting. There have been some outlying variables that nobody could have imagined that's impacting the supply and the demand here in Acadiana, which is why on this episode we've got Mr. Bill Bacque back on Real Talk, who is Acadiana's premier real estate data analyst and arguably the best dressed real estate professional in our area. And he's bringing Acadiana's mid-year real estate market report. And it's always a great conversation when Mr. Bill's on, and we're gonna unpack everything that you need to know about whether you're a buyer, whether you're a seller, maybe you're an investor, or you might just want to keep a pulse on what's happening with your real estate value. All right, guys, welcome back to Real Talk. So excited to have my good friend Bill Bacque here. Today, we finally have, 6 months under our belt for 2023, so we can actually see how did we perform in 2023 and moving forward. We're going to be talking today about supply and demand. We're going to talk about prices, appreciation, equity, what's going on in the luxury market, new construction. And even, we're gonna talk about the difference between inventory and new inventory, and how all of that is going to affect you as a buyer or a seller, or maybe you're an investor. So let's dive right into it, Mr. Bacque. Thank you so much for being here once again.
My pleasure. Hope everybody's staying cool in this summer swelter.
It's been a little warm outside.
It sure is.
So, let's just dive right into it. So let's talk about how so far this year, how has the markets performed?
Well, what I generally, when people ask me that question, my immediate response is, well, it depends on your perspective as to how the market is. What we all should know is where we've come from.
Right.
Okay. And, although it's now been 2.5 years, but we're basically looking at real estate in the pre-COVID, the COVID, and the post-COVID years. And if you think about it, the pre-COVID years were really about 2.5 years ago. In 2020, mid-year was when the
effects of
the lock-in.
Yeah.
Was lifted, and now we saw this pent-up demand just come into the marketplace, and to a large degree stay in the marketplace for 2 consecutive years, actually 2.5 years. In 2020, home sales for 2020 were up 10.4%. In 2021, which was the post-COVID lockdown craziness, and it was when our interest rates were at some of their lowest levels, below 2%, below 3%. We had again 10.4% increase in 2020, an 18.3% increase in 2021, and then by mid-year of last year, we started to see the economic effects of the spending levels that we'd had for the last 3 years start taking an impact or having an impact in the economy in the form of inflation. And then we started to see the Fed raising interest rates. And so in 2022, we said, okay, by mid-year, that's just a year ago, through mid-year, we were right up with where we were in the boom time of 2021. But the last 6 months, we started to see the interest rate impact our marketplace. And so we predicted, hey, this is all going to end, because we went to levels that we have not seen never before seen.
Right.
And while the number of sales were up 18%, the dollar volume during that 2021 had gone up 30%. It was crazy.
Right, and I think there's a distinction too. What was interesting, what we were dealing with then versus now, we had demand driving everything, but we also had the supply to feed that demand.
Absolutely, we did.
And so that's now shift, and we're gonna go over some data about this where, we still have more demand than supply. However, the new listings coming onto the market is where we're lacking our supply and demand is not balanced not because we have too much demand, it's because we don't have enough supply.
Well, that's certainly feeding it. But ultimately, at the end of the COVID-inspired demand increase, okay, we had a readjustment that began really at mid-year last year where we said, hey, this 2.5-year craziness in our market is now going to start to return to normal. So we're going to start seeing negative markets. Last year was the beginning of that. From June through December, ended up in the culmination of that being the year was down about 13.5% in sales last year. Okay. Now remember, in the 2 previous years, it had gone up like 30% in units. Okay. It had gone up 50% in volume. So we had a 13.5% adjustment in sales and about a little over 7% adjustment in volume.
Oh.
And that was the beginning of the adjustment. So going into this year, we knew that was something that we're not through dealing with. That little adjustment was ultimately just the beginning. And so what do we see now?
What slide are you on?
This year, I'm going to be on page 12.
All right, there we go. That shows our sales for this year.
So how are we doing now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, we're down about 23% overall. Okay. This is all throughout Acadiana compared to last year. That's correct. Through June. Okay. Now that's throughout the Acadiana market. And if you look on page 14, you can see that in Lafayette, we're down actually 30%. Okay. So one of the things we've seen coming out of the COVID boom is that we've seen our market decline, but its decline overall has been less in Acadiana than its decline in Lafayette Parish. So Lafayette Parish was hit the hardest.
Sure.
As far as the adjustment is concerned. And that's a half year. We're not through yet. I think we're going to be looking at more adjustment throughout this year, but less dramatic.
Right. Well, and that's a function of a few different variables, right? So inside of Lafayette, our average sales price is much higher. So, in theory, you got higher interest rates. It's going to lower the demand. It's going to be greater impact in the higher price range areas versus outside the parish where it's the average sales price is lower. So it should have a less impact. The increase in interest rates. Then we also have insurance.
Yeah.
The affordability of homes outside the parish is a lot better than inside of Lafayette.
Absolutely. And as a result of that, one of the things that we've ultimately discovered or uncovered in the data this year is that we're starting to see hard evidence of what I call the migration of buyers away from Lafayette Parish and it to adjoining parishes. And just to give you a flavor for that, last year,
16,
at the end of the first half of last year, sales outside of Lafayette Parish made up about 34% of the total sales, housing sales. This year, for the first half, sales outside of Lafayette Parish make up over 40%. So we've gone from 34% to 40% in the market share of residential sales outside of Lafayette Parish. That, to me, is the clearest indication that there is a flight for affordability. Because
and I want to make that point. I don't think Lafayette, is less desirable. I just think that there's more buyers that can afford outside of Lafayette Parish, and there's more supply. I mean, just drive around, go down West Bayou, East Bayou Parkway, in some of those traditional neighborhoods that, have been, some of the core of Lafayette G1, G2 areas. There's not a lot of inventory or options out there.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And look, I don't want to say that it's booming necessarily in outlying parishes. If you look at slide 17, the next one, these are just giving you a look at what's happening outside of Lafayette Parish. Well, you do have positive numbers coming out of Iberia, but the other parishes are in fact suffering a shifting of the market also.
Right.
But what we are seeing is that their sales and volume numbers are less of a decline than we're seeing over here.
Which is great, and we want to see that in other outlying parishes. We want to see that grow. And we've seen in the last 3 years, you've mentioned multiple occasions, like we've never seen this type of growth in the outlying parishes until 2020,
right?
2020,
right. Another example of that too is in new construction. And now new construction is kind of a good bellwether thing to watch when you're looking at overall data, because what new construction does, especially when you're looking at affordability, new construction always sets the highest limit of whatever you're looking at, because it's brand new.
Right, it's brand new.
And so what's happening to new construction sales is kind of an interesting thing too. What we have seen because of the shortage of inventory, I'm on page 18, through June of this year, there have been 726 new construction sales that have been reported throughout Acadiana, totaling a little over $200 million. That's an overall decline of little over 10% on sales and a little bit over below 6% on dollar volume. Now, keep in mind that the overall sales in Lafayette Parish are down 30% from last year. So the decline overall in new construction is only 10.3%. But here's the real kicker. Of those 651 sales that we did in the first half, 198 of them, totaling almost $51 million, were outside Lafayette Parish. That's a 46% increase in sales of new construction outside Lafayette Parish, and it's a 52% increase in the dollar volume of new construction sold outside of Lafayette Parish. Why? And one of the things that I look at, well, the average sales price for new construction through June in Lafayette Parish was a little over $330,000. Yeah. The average sales price for new construction outside of Lafayette Parish is a little bit over $256,000. That's about a $73,000 on average difference in new construction. Why are we seeing an increase in new construction outside of Lafayette Parish? I rest my case.
Yeah, it's easy. It's just more affordable. It's more affordable for the builder. There's better margins for the builder than in Lafayette Parish. And on top of that, the where the demand is in that lower price range. I mean, some of the new construction houses that you're seeing in Lafayette, they're in a much higher price range, and that's not where majority of that demand is currently.
In the upper end, and this may seem kind of a funny use of terms, but on the one hand, where we have new construction in Lafayette on the high end versus much lower prices in other parishes, is one thing. People who have money, equity, or dollars, interest rates don't matter at all. If I'm paying cash, I don't really care that the interest rate today is 7% versus it was less than 2.5 years ago. Doesn't matter to me because I'm not borrowing any money. But if you're borrowing money, that's where the impact ultimately is. You're going to feel it. And it impacts certainly a buyer, because a buyer can qualify or feel comfortable with a certain monthly payment. Okay. And if the interest rates go up, that monthly payment goes up. So the discomfort goes up accordingly. and we've seen substantial amounts of increases in interest rates over the last 2.5 years. And as a result of that, the impact has been a shift toward what people are buying because of affordability. Now, there are certain people that are insulated from that, and that, again, is your cash buyer. And I know later on in our discussions, we're going to be looking at the upper end and what's happening there.
Yeah. And so, like, I wanted to go back to your this chart right here, because this is the number of reported sales this year compared to last year, and this is for
that's Lafayette
Parish,
right?
But whether we're looking at our whole market or just Lafayette Parish, you predicted earlier this year that we probably are going to see some type of crossover, and you can see that the difference between the deficit or the delta between 2022 and 2023 seems like it's getting a little bit less and less. And when we really saw the effects of that high interest rate hike going from 3 to 5, I mean, that happened in the spring, but we already had things under contract. So
you're absolutely right.
So now we see that decline. Do you still anticipate us to cross over at some point in this year?
I absolutely do. And I think where we will see that, and you hit the nail on the head, when we look at closed sales, what you're actually looking at is market activity that's as much as 2 months old.
Yeah.
Because it takes from the time you go under contract to the time you close, if you're getting a loan and all that, it's going to take a couple months generally. So this market activity that we're seeing in June was actually market activity in the actual marketplace that might be happen, April, May,
right,
at the latest. And so ultimately, what we saw last year was that interest rates really started to go up around June, or actually it was around April.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started seeing the decline in closures, and you can see the dip right here.
Yep.
Last year,
Yep.
Significant dip. This was interest rates.
Yeah, we didn't see anything really start to impact until like July.
That's
it started to coming down.
That's correct. And one of the things that we're going to look at to see is there really crossover possibilities that we can look forward to in the second half of this year, where we get a bird's eye glimpse of that in our numbers in June, is when we look at what's going on to a contract pendings. And what we will see, I'll give you a little, quick look ahead. What you will see is that the narrowing of the numbers that we're putting on the board now, pending, versus where we were last year, that gap has narrowed. Actually, in overall pendings, they've already made the crossover.
Mm-hmm.
Made the crossover in numbers, but didn't quite make the crossover in dollar volume. Again, indicating that people are much more sensitive this year to price than they were last year.
Right. Well, let's talk about prices. So, we're talking about this actual sales, and this is, overall sales, and we know the majority of those sales are in the 300 to 200 to 350 range. That's the majority of them, and that's nationwide. I mean, that's across the country. That's where the demand is. Every price range is different. Like Mr. Bacque says, is this, when somebody asks you how prices or the real estate market is doing, it really depends on where your neighborhood is, because I could sit here and say, well, it's still a seller's market. We don't have enough inventory. We have more demand than inventory, and prices are still rising. But that doesn't necessarily mean in your neighborhood, because it's a function of supply and demand.
You're right, and the other side of this is quantify what we're talking about as far as the level of demand. That is, there is still a relatively strong demand for housing. And demographically, there are a number of reasons for that. We still have a lot of people who are forming families now. There's going to be demand for that into the
life changes and
life changes, you name it. So the demand is still here, but what it is, it's somewhat muted. 2.5 years ago, what was the demand was overheated because of a couple of factors. Number one, you had interest rates that were in the 3% range. Now they're 7% range. Right. The other thing is that you had a shortage of housing, and an extreme amount of demand of buyers. And so
and we had a shortage of overall inventory, but what's interesting is we listed more houses than we ever did at that time. So we were able to feed it.
but not enough to keep up with that
Right,
demand.
not enough to keep up.
And now that demand is muting, and we're starting to see, even though the new listing inventory has been influenced by what we call the shadow inventory, that is, sellers who are not ready to put their house on the market because they're sitting on low interest rate loans that they can't replicate when they go out and buy a new one. And so they're waiting for the equity in their home to actually become positive and not just make up for the loss of interest rate that they're going to suffer by trading in their old loan. And so that's why we're seeing that the demand is still relatively strong, but where that demand is being challenged is where we're seeing the greatest impact of what's happening with interest rates. And that is that buyers are looking to buy overall, generally speaking, less expensive product today than they did 2.5 years ago, simply because the cost of that product has not gone down dramatically enough to offset the cost of acquiring that product.
Well, and we saw that same thing happen during COVID, like right when it started. Okay, spring or January 2020, we had an amazing January, record-breaking January. We were going into the spring; it was looking really, really good. February happened. We went into Mardi Gras. Right after Mardi Gras, COVID hit and the world ended. I really didn't. They shut down the whole economy. Nobody could put any house on their contract, but for the next few months, we were still closing everything that was happening from January, February, and then it just stopped, right? And then when things started to change, the perception of the pandemic, people started coming back out of their houses probably around July of 2020, and that's when we started putting things under contract. But we saw, and I expected then to have pent-up supply and pent-up demand. I knew for a fact a lot of our clients had fallen off and said, you know what, we don't know what's going to happen. We're not going to put our house up for sale, and we're not going to go look at a house. That started to change in July of 2020. Really is really when it started to impact our business. And I think we're seeing the same thing. This is a study from Freddie Mac. And this is the housing sentiment. They do a survey, and I just want to get your opinion on this. They're saying nationally that 18% of people are saying that they're thinking about buying a home in the next 6 months, and 16% thinking about selling. And the national average is closer to 8 to 10%. So it does seem, if you can believe the data from this survey, that there is still right now pent-up supply, which we know there's people who are tied to a lower interest rate that are thinking about selling, but they're going through that process and saying, well, wait a second, we have a 3% interest rate, and now interest rates are 6.5%. With a one, you can do a buy down and maybe get it to 5.5% if you want. But either way, they know that the cost is going to be greater than it was before. But what they're also, I think, identifying now is they have more equity because prices have continued to go up.
Right.
So they have more equity to power that move and keep that mortgage rate. And maybe they have enough equity to make that move and still not have the impact of a greater note.
That's correct. And I think we are going to need in the ensuing years as we work our way through this lower interest rate versus current interest rate environment. We need to ultimately be able to be better at understanding when and what the cost of that equity is. And one way of doing that.
So do you think that there is pent-up supply? You think there's people out there now just holding on until something changes, they get comfortable with the situation?
I do. There is still strong demand. It's not as rabid, let's put it that way, as it was 2.5 years ago. Because what you had 2.5 years ago was a shortage of inventory relative to demand, just like we have now. Okay. What you also had was you had these enormously, historically low interest rates. So you had people competing for this inventory because they wanted to get the rate. Okay. Now, today, they still want, people want the inventory, but they don't have the rate incentive. So now they're less inclined to necessarily, whereas you as a seller would maybe had even an expectation 2.5 years ago, you put your house on the market at X price and you're likely to get bids that were over that and multiple bids.
It was like
that's not the environment today.
That's kind of what we had. We had high demand.
There is still the possibility, if you put an exceptional house on the market and you price it right, that there will, because there is this shortage, there will be, there are still people competing for it. That possibility exists. But where that was the rule before, now it's the exception. So your expectations should not necessarily be, I'm going to put my house on the market and I'm going to have 65 people coming in to look at it and 10 offers, and they're all going to be above that, and everybody's going to kumbaya. That's not the environment that we're in now.
No doubt. And I think you brought a good point, like just in the real world, like with us selling houses and working with the buyers, we absolutely need more inventory. There's no question about that. But, back a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we're talking about, we were struggling almost every sale getting the appraisals. We always, because we were selling at the top of the market. Now we've got the data, and it's very likely that I can, on an appraisal, justify a price, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's where the market is. Whereas 2 years ago, the market was much higher than the justifiable price, but you had that appraisal, to really keep things in check. But dude, we sold lots of houses above appraisal. Actually, we analyzed it. I think we sold an additional $3 million over appraised value in 2021, I think it was. So, I mean, that's a lot of money that was on top of that. So that continued. Every time you sold a house above that appraised value, it reset the market. So now that's the market value. I mean, you saw it. We saw it in new construction. We saw it in, and arguably new construction had to, because the cost of the materials went up significantly. But definitely, for instance, the St. Streets, the average price per square foot is now significantly higher. And, I tell a lot of our clients, it's we still are selling our houses at the top of the market. It wasn't until, I think last month where we started to see the prices year over year started to, stall out and drop.
And ultimately what we need to be able to do, and it starts with us as real estate professionals being educated to being able to do it, and then being able to transfer that knowledge to our clients, is that we need to be able to give a seller an idea of what the true cost of that equity exchange is going to be.
Right.
Okay. And one way that you can do that is take the seller's existing note, what it is now. Okay. If he's got a 3.5% interest rate, take what that principal and interest payment is, okay, based on the original loan amount, okay, and take, if it was at 3.5, run that with an amortization calculator on what that payment's going to be at, let's say, 5.5%.
You can do it on a iPhone now. You don't need a.
I'm just an old guy. Okay, so
I don't even know how to work that, but
you get the payment. What's the payment?
Yep.
On your equity at 7%.
Right.
Okay, and what's the payment now that you have on it? Now take the payment that you're going to have at 7%, okay, and put that into a payment and then search for present value, saying, if I had this at 5.5%, okay, this payment, what would I be able to borrow? And that's going to be the difference between what you would see at the old rate and the new rate. That's your equity cost.
That's right.
That's your equity cost.
Yeah.
And now you've got a number to say, okay, if this number is a real number relative to the marketplace, maybe you don't sell.
Right.
Okay. Maybe you don't. But maybe you'll find that, yeah, your equity cost might be $25,000. Okay. But you might have $75,000 worth of equity. So you're still $50,000 to the good.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a great.
Now, if you're losing all of your equity appreciation to that loss in interest rate, then there is no value. Now you're going to have to make your decision: do I want to buy or not, based on need? That is, I need a bigger house. Right. I just had a child. I got to get, we got to move. We got to do this.
Yeah.
Okay. Or I'm being relocated. Well, I got a new job. Or I got this. There are all kinds of reasons. Okay. But the economic one is, if you're not making the reason for economic reasons, then you should know what that reason is. It should be a number. It should be something that you can use as a judgment tool.
And, and I also think you have to be thinking as well, like, what does the numbers tell you? Where are we going, right? And if you're looking at these numbers, it looks clear to me, and I want to get your opinion, that we seem to be getting to the peak. If we've not hit the peak so far as prices, we still have low inventory. I'm predicting, just like there was in the past, that there's pent-up supply that could be released. I mean, we're on a tightrope right now. Like, it seems like to me we are on a tightrope, and one side of that is, we've got low supply, which is keeping our prices, reasonable, but it looks like we're moving towards a more balanced market. And if and when that release of the supply hits the market, it will dramatically affect the price if interest rates are still high and we have low demand. It's really a balancing tool. Like, I would imagine, like, we want to see the supply increase at the same rate as the demand increases so we can keep that balanced market. I mean, we don't need to be at 3 months of inventory, but if we were somewhere around 4 to 5 months of inventory, which is, normal for pre-pandemic levels, it seems like, I mean, if you're a seller right now, you've got to be thinking, okay, yeah, I might wait until my interest rate is better, but, you could also be waiting until there's a whole lot more supply on the market and prices could start to fall.
You're right. And your point's very, very valid in this regard. We already know that the amount of inventory coming on the market is at historically low levels. As a matter of fact, if you look at a number of new listings that we've taken on the market since June overall, or through June overall, if I remember right, we're at 2014 levels, Acadiana-wise, new listing numbers. New listings in Lafayette Parish are at 2012 numbers. So we're really depressed as far as the amount of new supply coming on the market right now. But the interesting thing is, when you look at the number of months supply of product, which is based not on new listings coming on the market, but the amount of active listings that are on the market. What we've seen over the last year, that is through June of this year, we're now overall in Acadiana about a 3-month supply of product, all price ranges.
Right.
And on average, last year was 1.6.
Right.
Okay. So your point is validized right there by saying, here we've had a market where we've had less product historically coming in than ever. Okay. Yet our number of months supply is increasing, and that's directly attributable to the other side of that supply demand,
right,
that being the demand side.
And just to bring everybody, we're talking about prices. We're talking about the increase in prices because it's a function of that supply and demand, and we calculate that supply by the months of inventory. Anything under 5 months of inventory is, considered a seller's market, where,
right,
if you're a seller, you want to be, coming into the market at that time. And and by the way, every price range has a different, months of inventory. So you've got to, be careful of what I'm saying, because it depends on your house, your neighborhood.
Be very careful of generalities. Okay.
Yeah.
And taking generalities and bringing them down to specifics. And let me give you a prime example of that on page 28, where we have average sale prices. Yes. Okay. These are the overall average sales prices for various parishes throughout Acadiana. Now, what I want to point out is, let's take Lafayette, because there was an article quoting me in the Daily Advertiser today, where they were talking about this specific thing in Lafayette Parish, that the average sales price through June is up relative to last year, okay? 1.24%. Okay? The problem with that generality is when you break it down, we find that actually the average sales price for existing homes through June in Lafayette Parish is down almost 4%, down, okay? What's up is the new construction average sales price, which is up almost 7%. And so as a result of the blending of the two, you have an overall average sales price that's showing a positive 1.25% increase. If I'm an average guy owning a house in Lafayette, I'm looking at that positive and trying to apply that to me. The reality is if you're in an existing home, on average, it's going down 4%. Okay? So be careful about these numbers. You have to have somebody who has the numbers, but more depth so that they can put you not only in an understanding of the numbers, but ultimately that you have a depth of that understanding.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, there's houses right now that you will be selling at the top of the market. No other house has ever sold at the price that you're going to get. But there's also neighborhoods and sub-markets or mini markets in different areas around Lafayette and Acadiana where it's the opposite, where prices are declining. There's less demand and more supply. So that's why, everything we're talking about today is overall market. But if you just took that, it looks like, we had massive appreciation and equity gain over the last 3 years. And now we're getting back to pre-COVID levels where, we're trying to work towards a balanced market, but the supply isn't playing the right game. So, that's keeping those prices where they are. Now, nationally, if you look at the data, which I thought this was pretty interesting to see, nationally, they started to see, this is Case Shiller, FHFA, and CoreLogic. You can see back in July of last year, we started to see nationally those prices start to dip. And then it wasn't until the springtime of this year we started to see that normalize. Now, back in July of last year, all of the news media wanted you to believe that we were heading towards a bubble was going to bust, prices were going to fall drastically. They did start to fall, but they didn't fall anywhere near the equity gain that we had gained over the last 3 years during COVID, and now it seems to be on a rebound. We didn't really experience that slowdown until this year. We started to see month over month those prices start to really basically, I think it was last month was one of the first months we saw month over month our average price dip below where it was in June of last year. You correct me if I'm wrong, but
no, I think you're right.
Yeah, so nationally, it seems like they're on the rebound. It seems like we're about 8 months behind that. And what would you say why are we not following here in Acadiana or Lafayette the same trends as the rest of the country?
Well, I tend to be a little specious about national real estate numbers, although in this particular environment we're in, because so much of what's impacting our real estate market now is to a large degree interest rate driven, and that is a national product. That is, the pricing for interest rates are pretty well standard throughout the country. So the impact of interest rate rises is having the same impact. So I do ultimately get, get that, but typically one of the truisms about real estate, because it's a physical characteristic of real estate, is that what they call fixity. Real estate is fixed to its location. Right. It is not an intrastate product. And so the idea of comparing a marketplace in Lafayette with a marketplace in Houston, for example, has some problems when you consider that it is the overall economy of what's going on around you that has more of an impact of what's going to happen buying and selling real estate than even the interest rate is concerned. So again, if you're in Florida, for example, and you are the recipient of a bunch of migration that's occurring for tax reasons or whatever from California, New York, or whatever, people moving into there, then that is impacting your marketplace. It's not going to impact Lafayette's marketplace that way. And so I don't mind having these general comparisons to national versus local, but be careful of understanding that what's going to impact more the nuances of what's going to happen relative to interest rates in the future, demand into the future. In the Lafayette Parish and Acadiana, it has more to do with what's happening in Acadiana and Lafayette Parish than anything else. So, for example, one of the things that could impact us well beyond another area of the country is hurricanes.
Right.
And insurance.
Right.
Okay, which is having a significant, that's well beyond the price of houses, but it is certainly a cost of having housing, and we're seeing insurance rates that are going through the roof and having ultimately the same kind of impact on prices and the economy, the real estate economy, that interest rates are having overall now. And so, again, just be careful about.
So that's definitely like the insurance is an issue that we're dealing with for affordability. I mean, prices. If you live in Louisiana, your prices are going up on insurance. So how is that affecting? Do you think that is having an impact on the supply? Like, some sellers are choosing not to just because that's part of the affordability equation? What's keeping all that supply pent up right now?
I think right now it is more a function of interest rates than anything. Yeah. Insurance, the actual impact of the insurance problem, if you will, or chaos, depending on what route you want to take, it really hasn't been felt yet. We've certainly getting a taste of it, and I'm sure you've had your agents coming in and saying, "Gee, I got a client whose insurance is gone from $800 to $8,000, $800 a year to $8,000 a year."
Yeah.
Okay. So it is beginning to have an impact, and we've also seen that our legislators this year in the legislative session carved out millions of dollars to give away to insurance companies just to entice them to come to Louisiana. It is a real problem. The impact that it could ultimately have hasn't been felt yet, but what I would suggest all our viewers do and all the real estate professionals do over the next 3 to 4 months is pray every night that we don't experience a major hurricane in Louisiana this year, because the impact of that on the future of availability of insurance could be dramatic.
Yeah.
And if you can't insure it, you can't sell it.
Yeah. And they put, like you said, some I had Jean-Paul Coussol on here, our representative, but they are working on putting legislation together. They also enacted something that could give us discounts if you put a fortified roof on,
right,
which is a great concept. And the idea of, okay, how do we fix this insurance problem here in South Louisiana? Well, we're not going to stop having hurricanes, right? So how do we change what we're doing to lower the cost of the impact to the insurance companies when a storm does come in? 90% of the damage from a storm is typically interior water intrusion that has, because you lose a roof, you lose shingles, and now water's penetrating, and you can't stop that water from coming in. So the fortified program they're using, it's just taping those seams. So like, even if you lose your roof, we're not experiencing the same damage and water damage from that just intrusion. Of course, you're gonna have flooding and stuff you can't stop, but if you ever been down to Lake Charles, they still have blue tarps on their roofs. And if you didn't need a blue tarp and your shingles came off and you're still waterproof, you still have that water barrier, you're gonna lose a lot less, which in turn is going to give a break to make us a little bit more insurable.
I think those are all very positive steps, but they are long-term solutions. The impact of them is going to take time. And so again, I think that what we've got to pray for is that we don't have some kind of calamity that's a short-term calamity that kind of blows everything out of the water.
Well, hopefully we don't. So, but today we're talking, we've got the prices. We just discussed, why the prices are increasing, but they are starting to slow down. Let's talk about that a little bit. What do you see moving forward throughout the rest of the year?
I feel, it's tough to try to prognosticate, look into the future and with any kind of real confidence. But my sense is I think there's going to be still a relative shortage through the remainder of this year of inventory relative to demand. So I just don't see a significant amount of pressure downward on prices. I don't see as much pressure upward either. So I'm predicting probably a stabilization, if you will, is a more probable scenario going into the remainder of this year. At the end of the year, we'll recalibrate and see how our inventory overall has fared in building up or coming out in particular price points. And that'll give us some indication of what to look forward to going into next year. But right now, I'm looking for the safest position, I think, is to say it looks like we're in a stable position if you graph it, and that the indicators are that that's going to continue forward through a stabilization. But remember, last year the market went down during the last 6 months. So I'm thinking that we're going to where we are down 30%, say year to date. That by the end of the year that number will be shaved a bit, so that what our prediction was at the beginning of this year was we thought we'd end up this year more looking like something the 2018, 2017 years, which were just pre-quote COVID, that we'd get back to some kind of number that would be the average of those two. And the dollar volume will remain a little higher because it's not going to be quite so sensitive. But that's what I look.
So you're thinking we're going to be moving back to what we all thought we would go back to at some point pre-COVID numbers, but how much is going to determine? But just it's going to be really we're going to watch it come together based on the actual supply or the release of the supply, that timing of the release of the supply and the timing of the demand that's coming up. So what does that mean for a buyer? I'm going to run through some scenarios. I want to talk about for a buyer, what is this data telling you? If you were a young family, you want to, sell your current house because you just had another kid and you're getting real tight and you need to move up. What would you tell that type of buyer in looking at this information, assuming they're in the 400 and under price range?
Well, again, if you're a first-time buyer, there's three basic needs that everybody has: food, clothing, and shelter. And so shelter is one of the top three things you have to do to be alive, okay? So I would first say, if you need a place to live, you need a place to live. So what's your options? You either can buy or you can rent. Okay, what's the future in renting? Well, the market's tight as far as inventory in the sales end. It's been fairly tight on the rental end, and so your rents are not dirt cheap either. And when you're paying rent, you're paying for someone else to have that asset. When you finance your own acquisition of a home, you're paying for yourself to have that asset. So the second thing is...
So that's a no-brainer. You're renting right now, you got to buy.
The second thing is that most people don't begin filing long forms they take the standard deduction on their income tax until they buy their first home, because the interest is deductible for tax purposes. It spurs on a home buyer, to now to do a long form and take the interest deduction and gives them an advantage there. so that the actual interest that they're paying is subsidized because it's deductible for income tax purposes by your tax rate is being subsidized or is subsidizing the interest rate. Then Uncle Sam allows that at any time during the ownership of your asset, your home, you decide to sell it and you make a profit, you don't pay any profit tax on that profit. Never. Every time you reinvest and you rebuy, you never pay a tax on it. And then once you get to be over 65 and you want to sell for the last time, if you're a couple, you can take $500,000 worth of accumulated gain and not have a one-time not pay any tax at all. All of those advantages are from home ownership, okay? The lack of home ownership versus the asset or what you get from home ownership it far outweighs the advantages than the disadvantage. The last point of it is time. That is, how long are you going to own that house? What we've seen over the last 2 decades is that the amount of time the average person that lives in a home has increased dramatically. It's actually more than doubled. It's gone from about 7 years to around 13 to 14 years. Okay. So if you're going to buy an asset that you won't be contemplating selling for another 10 to 14 years, who in the world knows what the world's going to be like 14 years from now? Okay. So what I would say, if you need shelter, and everybody does, and you want to get involved in asset building, accumulation, and wealth, then you begin that journey by ownership of a house. You don't begin that journey by renting a house.
That's right, and that's the best way to build wealth. Now, let's talk about the seller that's on the fence right now, and that's going to be a buyer from a young family perspective. And then I want to know what you would say to somebody like yourself, an empty nester who is now probably thinking, a baby boomer thinking about downsizing and moving. Like, what would you tell them directly, assuming they are, very similar, the average buyer and seller? How does this data, what do you see here that you would want to, let them know about how this affects them as a seller and as a buyer?
Well, again, as a seller, I think ultimately you make the same decisions or you're influenced in making your decisions just as a buyer is on certain factors. For an elderly person, I have a large house. I've lived in a house that we own for 30 years. It's a relatively large house, and there's just my wife and I that live in it. So we're faced with the decisions. Do we stay in this house? Do we not stay in the house? I think those are more decisions that are, I guess economics plays into it, but it's more a decision of physical things like we have step-ups to go into rooms. Well, at 72 years, stepping up is a lot more challenging than it was 30 years ago. So all these things come into play. If you ultimately are, it's about needs. Let's just boil it down to that. It's about needs. That is, right now, I'm comfortable with the needs that I have with the house that I have. But when that need that I have no longer matches the house that I have, then for whatever reason, whether that spurs you on to be a buyer or whether that spurs you on to be a seller, it's all about where is my life relative to this particular asset. What's the exchange or interchange there? And it's different for everybody. So, I can't say that at 75, you need to be looking at maybe a lifestyle change and go to the Blake or the Vincent or something. So that could be an option of downsizing. It could be that you just want another house downsizing. It could be you want another neighborhood. All those things are factors that I don't think interest rates and the overall market environment does have an impact on it. But in my 50 years in the real estate business, it seems to me that people first make the decision, I think I want to move, or I think I want to buy. And then once they've gotten to that, then they look at what are the market indicators that are going to impact my decision. But the ultimate decision first starts with that decision that leans toward food, clothing, shelter. I need shelter, or I need to change my shelter. Whatever that factor is still going to be a strong motivating factor for a buyer to become a buyer or a seller to become a seller, regardless of what our history of interest rates are. And one of the things, just the last point to that, when you look at the average interest rate that we paid in the country over the last 50 years, the average is about 7%. So we're not in the 1980s where you were looking at 13, 14, 15, 17%. We're not in that environment. It seems like it might be that dire simply because only 2.5 years ago, we were in an interest rate environment that had never existed, ever in the history of our country. Okay, so we can't use that benchmark for anything other than measuring pain points going into the short term. It is not anything to be using as a benchmark for future long-term activity.
So I'm gonna nail you down a little bit more on this. So let's assume that they have the option. They could sell this year, they could sell next year, and they can buy this year and next year. Like, based on the data that you have, do you think they should hold out to put their house on the market, or would you say, if there was an option, they don't have to do anything, but if there was a better time, which we know historically there's going to be, less supply, which means there's probably going to be a higher price or more supply.
Yeah.
Where do you think we're moving towards, or do you think it's more of a neutral market that, it won't matter if you're putting it up for sale now or this time next year?
Well, I'd probably go more toward the latter and saying it's not really going to matter. But then let me temper that. Your question was based on the overall general data. Should I or should I not do something? I think based on the overall data, I would feel comfortable that we are into a more stabilization mode of shift in the marketplace. But before I make any decision, I would go and do one thing that you had mentioned, and that is you need to drill down a little deeper than this.
Yes, sure.
Okay? Because price points mean everything. If you're above 300,000, there is in the market, there's a market. Okay, if you're in the market between 150 and 299,000, there's a market.
Sure.
There's a market under 150,000. So depending upon where you are, you're going to have to drill a little deeper and find out, well, what's happening in there. And that's where having the right professional advising you is still, even in a market where it seems like, hey, man, this is just crazy. You put your house on the market, it sells.
Yeah.
Okay, you still need a real estate professional because it's just not that easy.
Right. So in general, you think it's going to be, for an average buyer or an average seller, we're not going to see much change that would impact you. If you're in the $300,000 price range, you wouldn't say, hey, you really should think about selling today because it looks like we're going to have way more supply and less demand tomorrow. Or do you it sounds like what I'm hearing you say is it looks like we're moving towards that balanced market, so it's not going to affect the price significantly one way or the other.
Not if you're going to be in a house for 13 years.
That's right.
Okay, yeah.
Now, let's talk about price, because we're in the luxury price market. I know you've got some data. If I am a seller and I have a 6,000 square foot house, what is the market doing there? What would you tell somebody what to expect coming into the market from the luxury standpoint?
Well, let's just look at sales first. And I'm looking at Lafayette Parish. You want to look at 30. And what this is all the sales. So it's existing sales of existing homes and new construction. And if you just look at these three quadrants, the first quadrant is sold below 150,000. Well, you can see it was a drop. That's a 17% decline, okay, from versus last year. 17% decline. The middle range sold between 150 to 299. That's the largest group, as you can see, of all. There we had about a 15.4% decline year over year. Then we have the upper end, where you can see the significant decline there has been about 30%. So you want to know the impact of what we've seen and the impact it's had on our overall market. You could argue it's had its biggest impact in the upper end. Okay, because you've seen the greatest number of sales declines in that. But the impact has been across the board. Now, what we have seen, let's say, for example, in the below 150,000, it's only about 14% of what's sold. So if you're looking for something below 150,000, good luck.
Yeah, there's just not.
There's a lot there in Lafayette Parish.
Yeah, so the sales
selection outside of Lafayette Parish.
and the sales are, the number of sales is a function of the demand, and we know that we have buyers right now that can't find things in the $200,000 price range. So that definitely affects the number of sales.
Now, an interesting thing about, even though it's hard to find something under 150,000, homes that sold in this price range below 150,000 up 14% from
Interesting.
From the they made up 14% of the total parish home sales that were tallied. They made up
14%.
14%. Last year there was 11.6.
Yes,
so even though it's the smallest percentage, there you've seen the impact of financing is driven some people into that. Okay, and so we see it as being a higher percentage of the market than it was last. Now, in the mid range, that price range of 150 to 299, it decreased by, as we said, 15.4. This price range makes up about 55% of all Lafayette Parish sales. Last year was 58%. Okay, so it's been impacted down.
Yeah.
Okay, and the upper price range, that's me. It's in my.
That's all good. Don't worry about it.
In the upper price range, okay, of which we saw went down 30%. This price segment was about 31% of all of our parish sales. Last year was 30.4. So of all these three segments, the only one that went up as far as market share, it went down in sales, but the market share grew, is still the upper end.
Yeah. So what do you say about that? Why, if you are a luxury homeowner and contemplating putting your house on the market and entering the market, what would you tell them? Obviously, we know we'd have to dive into their specific area.
You do, but what I would generally say is that of all the price points or price quadrants that are impacted by interest rates, yours is impacted the least.
Yeah.
Why? Because people who have money don't care.
Right.
Okay. As a matter of fact, they may be even more positive situation because for years, for the last certainly 10 to 15 years, people who had cash, money, wealth, were in fact, use this term, discriminated against as far as what they could earn on their money because the government was keeping interest rates tamped down unrealistically. Yeah. Now that environment has changed to where I'm getting 5.5% on my cash investments. Right. I'm in pretty good shape. Okay. And I may have enough cash to not even not even need a mortgage loan. So what do I care?
Right.
And now, what we do see ultimately has happened in that marketplace is in the number of listings on the market for sale, active listings, that is a market area where we've seen increased inventory. So there's much more competition, much more selection. It's a different market environment than if I'm looking to buy in the 150 to 199 or 299.
Right, right. Yeah, that has to play a factor. What is the supply in your area? If you're the only one that's listed and your price where, you're in the the price range that all the other houses have sold for in the last 6 months, and you're the only one, if you position it properly in the market, you should be able to get the results within 60 to 90 days.
Right. So it's interesting. If we look at Lafayette Parish in that 300,000 and up, there is a 4.6 month.
41.
That's 41. 4.6 month supply of product. Okay. Now, overall in Lafayette Parish, you look on page 38, it's 2.9 months. That's the overall number of months supply.
Yeah, 2.9.
2.9 months. In the under 150, it's 1.1 month.
Yeah.
Okay. If you're in the 150 to 299, it's 2.3 months.
All right.
If you're in the 300 and up, it's 4.6 months. And if you look at the various, on that page 41, various price points in that 300 and above, we've got some price points where there's a 10-month supply or a 7-month supply. Or if you're $1 million and over, you have a 12-month supply.
Yeah.
So even though interesting, there have been 16 sales so far this year in the $1 million and up range in Lafayette Parish, okay? But there's 34 active listings on the market.
Right.
Ergo, a 12.8 month supply.
Yeah.
So if I go to somebody who's got $1 million house and they're looking to sell it, what am I going to tell them? Well, I'm not going to tell them that the overall 2.9 months has anything at all relevant to where they're going to be positioned in the marketplace. This is what they have to look at.
Yeah.
And that their expectation, if there's a 13-month supply on the market, their expectation needs to not to be, hey, I should be expecting an offer next week.
Well, and look, if you're in the $1 million and up, and if I'm a seller, I'm looking at this, I'm like, okay, wait a second. Let's say I'm at $1,100,000, and I've been on the market for 6 months, and there's 12.8 months of inventory in that price range. If I just dropped it to right under $1 million, I'm at now 7.7 months of inventory. I have a lot less competition.
You certainly can look at those.
And you can make some decisions based off of that.
Absolutely.
I also would recognize that, some of these properties that have been on the market for a while maybe came onto the market when it was super hot, and their expectation was, oh, well, I'll sell it if I can get X, Y, Z, and it's not selling. If it hadn't sold in the last 2 years, then your price is probably not right, because there's no reason why anything shouldn't have sold if you've done anything. So
absolutely.
I think it's interesting because we do have luxury properties that come up. We had one just this weekend, and we had multiple showings and multiple offers right away. So, this isn't an indication of every house with in the $1 million and up. It's just telling you how many other what's the market looking like as you're entering it.
Right.
And so just noticing that, but then having your real estate expert get in there and really show you where you need to be priced. But price is just one part of it. There's lots of there's 115 other different variables that you've got to manage to make sure that you're getting top dollar.
Right. And again, we've had discussions throughout this podcast about the relationship between demand and supply, and how demand has been through the roof in the last few years, and now it's dropped. And so let's go again, revisit it. That Lafayette Parish sales up 300,000 and up. The demand measurement, we talked about it, they're down 30%. Sales are down 30% in that 300,000 and up range in Lafayette. The number of months supply, though, has grown from 1 to 4.6 months. Last year was 3 months.
Right.
So the number of months supply has gone up. So we can see in relationship why that's happened. Well, the demand has gone down 30%. So you're going to have growth in the amount of just keeping inventory the same.
Yeah.
You're going to see increased number of months supply of product. That's why our prediction is, as this year progresses, we're going to continue to see more and more inching up of the number of months supply of product, regardless of the fact that the number of new listings are still being pinched downward.
Yeah.
And over time, because that number of months supply is going to continue to move toward equilibrium, we're going to see the market stabilizing as a result of that.
Moving towards a balanced market.
That's it.
Right. Which we're not there yet, but it is a tightrope, because if that supply comes online before the demand increases, we could see significant decrease in our average price. But if things keep going the way they are, and the supply hits the market at the same rate that the demand increases, then we should probably see a slow movement back to a balanced market.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue into, we've touched on this. What do we use to give us credibility in making forecasts? And I said we look at what's being put under contract, because these are the sales that we're going to be seeing a month or two down the road. So if we look at page 43, for example, these are the pendings that were run on July the 11th. Now, I qualify that because every time a pending falls through for whatever reason, doesn't close, then they adjust that number. They go back and adjust that number.
Yeah, right.
So, for example, on July 11th, there were 538 pending sales for the month. Okay, and you notice that is above the line, the crossover line. Okay,
which means 3 months from now we could see that meet or break that line.
That's exactly right.
Sales, yeah.
So now I will say that since July,
you can see that, and that's the pendings is really started to be affected. This time last year, we started to see that negative impact.
That's exactly right. And we're not going to have the same influences that were impacting here going here. That is why it's pretty easy to say.
We are going to probably see that just seasonality. If you compare this line to 2017-18, it's going to be less and less, but it's probably going to start to be higher than it was last year.
Exactly. That's what we...
And I think that's what's important. I mean, because you look at like year-over-year numbers, that's not as important to me as, how we are moving forward, right?
What's your trajectory?
Yeah, what's my trajectory? Like, just in anything, I want to see that month over month, I want to see July better than, better than June, and so on and so forth. And at least we're seeing that. And I think that's only thing I can think of is it's got to be a realization that, there are people willing to make the decisions, and they're just moving back towards.
You're exactly right. Now, if you look at the next pin, this is Lafayette. Okay, again, didn't quite make crossover, and that's again that our Lafayette market has been impacted more than the market overall because of what's happening outside of Acadiana. Other interesting thing is the next one, okay, is the dollar volume of those pending sales. And while this is the overall, and while we saw the numbers above breakthrough line, not quite there yet on dollar volume, and that's kind of indicating what we've been talking about, that people are still looking to buy a little bit less expensive, a function of the interest rate environment. And if you look at the next one, that's Lafayette Parish, same basic, following the same trend.
And which is showing we should expect a lower average price in the fall of this year versus the spring. I would imagine.
I would imagine.
Yeah,
okay.
That's got to be.
At least there's nothing that's going to ignite it to be anything, but trading in a very narrow range.
So if I'm a seller, I mean, you could look at this and say, sure does look like we're peaking out. This would be the peak of the time to sell if I'm reading this data right.
It certainly could influence you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, and when I say the peak, it's kind of like back in 2018-19, I'd bring you over and I'd say, this was the best January we've ever had, but it was only like 2% higher than the year before and 2% higher the year before that. So it's not going to be significant.
And seasonally, things do slow down in the fall. So, we're in the spring and summer are our top, generally our top seasonal times of the year. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
I was looking at the data for, Louisiana and Lafayette as far as the average appreciation going back to the 80s. And going all the way back to the 80s, Lafayette has experienced on average 2.8%, which is lower than the Louisiana average, which is just over 3%. And if I took that number and went back to 2018 and 19 and applied that, you should be closer to like the $255,000 range versus where we are now in the 280s. And, so we've experienced an influx of demand the last few years, which has created higher increases in prices. What are we looking at the last 3 years? Like a 20% increase?
Yeah.
Since 2020.
But the interesting thing is, incrementalism is a powerful thing. And you talked about if over time the average appreciation rate is just 3%, what does that do? Well, let's go back and say to where the average person owns a home for 13 years. If you have 3% average annual appreciation and just used a simple rate, not a compounded rate, because what you're actually getting is it's 3%, and then next year's 3% on the 100% plus 3%, then it's 3% on that. Okay, so you get a compounded.
Sure.
If we just used a simple 3% times 13 years, that's 39% increase over the life of the house you own. Okay, that should give comfort to anybody who's worried about what's happened in the last 2 to 3 years. Okay, time heals everything.
That's right.
Okay,
especially in real estate.
especially in
Unless you're living in a city that's a coal mine and they're shutting down the coal mine, and now you may be
for the oil wells.
Or the oil wells. But when looking at that and assuming that, guys, we experienced unreal amount of demand, and we sold a lot of properties, and we're moving back to where we were pre-pandemic, which means over the next decade, we should probably expect what we saw the last 3 decades, which is on average 2.8%, which means, guys, at some point it has to start to either not appreciate for some years, or we're going to see a little bit of depreciation in order to catch back up. Because I believe that if you look in 2030 versus 2020, it's probably going to average around 3% appreciation within that decade. So, and you've seen it 5 other times where, we saw a lot of a balanced market from 2015 to 2019.
Absolutely.
And I think that's going to look a lot like that moving forward, which was not a bad thing.
Well, if you go back to those graphs where we basically looked at sales going back to 1980, so 50 years, okay, we can see there have been a few little dips, but the general rule has been this is what's happened as far as dollar volume. This is what's happened as far as volume.
Yeah.
About average sales price. So I think long term, the asset class of owning real estate is still a viable decision. Residential real estate gives you the added benefit of not just having it as an asset class that clearly over time historically appreciates and builds wealth, but it also provides you a place to have a family, raise a family, to have a center of your operations, and to enjoy life in it.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think we can end on that note. Again, Mr. Bill, thank you so much for being here. Your insights into the market and the 50 years of experience is just, it's priceless. And, if you're thinking about buying or selling, it's
Call Jim Keaty.
Important that you either call somebody at Keaty Real Estate preferably, but any realtor in Acadiana, and make sure you have the facts and you can come up with a strategy that works for you. And with that, if you want to hear more of this, just remember to like and subscribe, and we'll have you back in another 3 months. We'll be doing our third quarter review.
God willing.
Thank you, Mr. Bill. Appreciate you.
Good.